All right, welcome everyone to this seminar series, which consists of 12 presentations that'll take place between now and December 7th every week. And the focus is on environmental problems and solutions. We've got a couple of people that might have their, should go on mute because we're hearing them in the background. Environmental problems and solutions as well for small island developing states. And most of the presenters will be talking about their experiences in the Caribbean, although many of these problems can apply to small island developing states all over the world. So let's see whether I can share my screen. So my presentation is meant to be a kind of an introduction, if you will, to the seminar series, talking a little bit about some of the topics that will be presented in by later presenters in the seminar series. So the title is an introduction to the environmental problems and solutions in small island developing states with a focus on the Caribbean. So the first thing we have to do for those that are not familiar with the region is to define what the Caribbean is. And typically that's thought to be the region of the Americas that consists of both the mainland areas as well as the islands within and surrounding the Caribbean Sea. Often also included are the Bahamas as well as the Turks and Caicos, but they're clearly in the Atlantic region. So I personally do not include the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos within the Caribbean region, but some people do. In addition to the island nations, we have many nations that border on the Caribbean Sea, including Venezuela, Colombia. You can see countries in Central America, as well as the Yucatan coast of Mexico are also included. And in some cases, you have some nations which are not within the Caribbean Sea, but they're typically included, such as Guyana is often included within the Caribbean region. Now, what's, I guess, interesting about the region is that there's many different types of geology. Their climates are different across many of the regions. Ethnicity is certainly different. Political systems and economic alliances. Of course, you have the colonial history of the Caribbean, in which you have the English, Spanish, French, as well as the Dutch influences, and some of these islands still have alliances with those original colonial nations. Others do not. And several different languages, of course, Dutch, French, Spanish, and English. And so cultures are quite varied as well. So it's a very diverse region, both in terms of human resources as well as the physical resources within the area. So what are we talking about when we refer to small SIDS, or small island developing states? Well, the criteria are within the Caribbean is that they are located in the Caribbean region. They are islands. They typically have small land areas and they have developing economies. But definitions vary. For instance, the UN also includes Belize and Guyana within the definition of small island developing states in the Caribbean, even though they're clearly not islands. So let's drill down a little bit and look at those criteria. Obviously, all of those islands which are in green here are located in the Caribbean. And as I mentioned, the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos, some people also include. But in terms of defining what is a small island, the UNESCO defines any island that has a land area less than 2,000 square kilometers as being a small island. And this excludes some of the islands in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica, and also the island Hispaniola, which includes both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And also, if you look at the table, you can see that a couple of the islands like Puerto Rico and Trinidad are actually above that threshold of 2,000 kilometers, and they would be included as medium-sized islands. But for the purposes of this talk, we'll also include Trinidad and Puerto Rico as small island developing states. Now, the other criteria, of course, is developing. If we use the UN Human Development Index, which includes things like annual income, health status, as well as education in calculating that HDI, any country that has a HDI less than 0.8 is considered to be developing. So this excludes some of the more richer islands, such as the Cayman Islands, which has an HDI close to 9.9, and also could exclude some other islands, such as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which you can see from the table have HDIs which are above 0.8. And also Barbados does as well. So, you know, definitions vary in terms of what developing means, but for the purposes of this talk and also the presentations of the other seminar speakers, we're going to include those islands, even though that they might not fall within the criteria of developing. So a study conducted a few years ago by Sharon Robinson. What she did was to conduct a survey. Well, part of the study was to conduct a survey among senior policymakers from Caribbean, small island developing nations to basically determine their views on the barriers to the economy as well as human resource development in those nations. And the most commonly cited barriers were one, insufficient finances. Many of these nations, especially for large infrastructure projects, rely on funding from international sources. And why is that a problem? Typically, these are project-based, so maybe building a wastewater treatment plant, or building a new wharf, or building some infrastructure. And that typically is over the short term, perhaps 4 or 5 years. And so there's no opportunity for any kind of long-term planning or a strategy, I suppose, to improve the economy, or to improve infrastructure, or improve human resources. So that's a problem. Lack of technical capacity. Many of these small islands, the best and the brightest, go to the UK or the US or Canada for education typically, or for opportunities to get employment, and don't return. And so this leads to what we call brain drain. The technical capacity within the islands is not what it could be if those individuals had remained in the small island developing nations. Over-reliance on tourism for economy was cited as another barrier. This means that, for instance, hotels can influence government, influence policy. So, for instance, on the pricing of water or other excuse me, other things which influence the tourism industry. The hotels can influence the government and certainly have some sway over the policies of the government. And also insufficient capacity for decision-making and long-range planning. This is basically a result of weak systems within the island nations for making decision-making and long-range planning. So those were cited as the most common barriers to the development of the islands, and certainly that's common throughout the entire Caribbean area. The other issue is what is the focus of development of these island nations? This is a lexiometric analysis done by the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean. And if you're not familiar with this type of analysis, basically they take a range of planning documents from particular regions, and they pull out of that the most commonly cited terms that are part of the planning documents. And as you can see, for the Caribbean, the nations are focusing primarily on economy, education, employment, as well as health, and also building up institutions. And you can see that environment is certainly included in the lexiometric analysis, but when it gets down to drilling down into the specifics of environmental issues, such as climate, water, sea and oceans, ecosystems, climate change, you can see that they seem to have a lesser focus in these Caribbean island nations. So the focus primarily in terms of development is on the economy, education, employment, and some of these other environmental issues have a lesser status, I suppose, in terms of their importance to the governments of those nations. So I just want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Sustainable Development Agenda. Some of you might be familiar with this, but basically this agenda was adopted by the United Nations and calls for the development towards specific goals from the start of the agenda in 2015 to 2030, which is we're well along in that process. And the SDG framework is organized under 17 specific goals, which are shown here on the diagram. There are 169 targets, which are defined within those 17 goals, and then 232 indicators, which are specific data, which are gathered in order to evaluate how nations are progressing in terms of achieving those goals. So you can see that in gathering all of that, those data for the indicators, there's a substantial effort which is needed to monitor as well as evaluate the progress towards the SDGs. So it's a huge task for any nation, and is especially problematic for some of these small island developing nations to gather that information. And I want to focus primarily on SDG 6, which focuses on water as achieving some of the goals towards better water quality, reductions in the amount of wastewater which is poorly treated, etc. So let's focus in on those targets for SDG 6, which is clean water and sanitation. There are some other goals which certainly have aspects which also include clean water and sanitation. So I'll talk a little bit about those. They are SDG 6, which is sustainable cities and communities, and then life below water, which is SDG 14. So I'll talk a little bit about those later in the presentation. So if we look at the targets for SDG 6, you can see that there are several of them. I want to focus first on 6.1 and 6.2, which relate to drinking water and also sanitation and hygiene. And these are targets set by the UN for universal access, so 100% access of the populations within countries to safe drinking water and also adequate sanitation and hygiene. So these are locked in as the targets to meet by 2030. So I have to move this so I can read it. So by 6.1, the first target is for by 2030 to achieve universal as well as equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. So one of the objectives is to have 100% of proportion of the population using safely managed drinking water services. And then if we look at 6.2, that is to, by 2030, achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all, and open defecation, and paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. So the criteria for that is 100% of the proportion of the population using safely managed sanitation services, etc. So if we look at the situation in the Caribbean, these are data that were pulled together by the once again, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is an organization that is organizing all of the data for that region, Latin America, as well as the Caribbean. And what you're looking at here is some data that were gathered in 2015. These are actually the latest data that we have, because these were data that were collected at the end of the previous goals, which are the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. And the collection of data since that time has been rather spotty. And indeed, you can see that not all of the nations within Latin America and the Caribbean have provided those data, even in 2015. So I've pointed out some of the Caribbean nations with the blue arrows here. You can see that in general, most of those Caribbean nations are getting close to achieving 100% access to safe or improved drinking water, as it's defined here. There's still a ways to go for some of those nations. But if you compare that to, for instance, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which, as I mentioned, share the island of Hispaniola, you can see that certainly for Haiti, they've got a long way to go in terms of providing access to safe drinking water in that nation. And the Dominican Republic as well has a way to go in terms of achieving those targets. So in general, one would say that the island nations within the Caribbean are pretty close to achieving the targets of 100% access to safe drinking water. And presumably by 2030, we'll be able to achieve that goal. But that will require some investment by those island nations. So what are the sources of drinking water for the Caribbean SIDS? Well, groundwater is an important source in some of the nations. So in Barbados, approximately 90% of the sources of drinking water is from groundwater. Over the entire Caribbean region, you can see that about 53% of drinking water comes from groundwater, 35% from surface water sources, but also desalinization or desalination is an important source. About 12% of water across the Caribbean region comes from desal plants. And rainwater harvesting is actually a very small percentage. So there's considerable incentives which are in place to try to increase the amount of rainwater harvesting across these island nations. So, for instance, desalination is the only source of drinking water in Anguilla, as well as the British Virgin Islands. And in Antigua and Barbuda, it's an important source as well. And in Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago, they have desal plants, which are also supplying some of their water. And then surface water is an important source in some of the island nations. So you can see that St. Lucia, 100% of the water comes from surface water sources, as well as Dominica and Grenada. And in St. Kitts and Nevis, it's about 30% of the sources of drinking water. So very varied sources of drinking water, often depending upon the hydrogeology of the islands in terms of whether they can access groundwater. And in those islands, which there is there are no appreciable surface water and groundwater resources, then desalination is the only option. I just want to talk a little bit about tourism and water use. In general, people use more water when on vacation. I'll show you some data in the next slide. And particularly in island nations in which water resources are scarce, this can cause both direct and indirect pressures on the water resources. And also, including in the Caribbean, in many countries, the peak tourism time is during the dry season. And so this can be an additional stress on sources of water. And in many cases, water demands favor tourism. So, you know, for instance, I've been in some Caribbean islands where, you know, there's water rationing going on for the general population, but the people that are in the hotels are not aware of that because there's no rationing going on in the hotels. So often this leads to some complaints among the local population about inequitable access to water resources. So this is kind of some interesting data here for a whole range of nations that have tourism as an important part of their economy. And in many of these nations, as you can see, tourists use more water during their vacations than the general population. So I pointed out, for instance, in Jamaica, the large disparity between water use among tourists as opposed to the general population. So this includes things like, you know, pools, as well as, you know, sanitation showers, that kind of thing. And water use certainly increases among tourists. So this causes additional stress upon the water resources, in particularly those Caribbean nations where water is a scarce resource. Just moving to sanitation. Here's the data also gathered by ECLAC in 2015 around achieving 100% access to improved sanitation. Once again, you can see that some of the nations within the Caribbean are pretty close to achieving those goals, but there are other nations which have a ways to go in terms of achieving 100% access to improved sanitation. And once again, I'm pointing out the situation in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, particularly in Haiti, where only a small proportion of the population has access to adequate sanitation. So some island nations in the Caribbean have a ways to go to achieve those goals by 2030. So that was the targets for 6.1 and 6.2, but as you can see, there are several other targets within SDG 6, and these include trying to reduce the amount of water which is used within those nations, managing the water resources, also managing ecosystems to improve the retention of water within those nations, etc. So I want to focus on 6.3, which is the targets around water quality and wastewater as it relates to the Caribbean. To focus on wastewater, the target is to, by 2030, improve water quality by reducing pollution, eliminating dumping, etc., and then halving the proportion of untreated wastewater. So this is a aspirational goal. So basically, the countries around the world can set their own targets in terms of the first of all, what constitutes treating wastewater. So that could be, you know, primary treatment, secondary treatment, or even tertiary treatment. and also set their own targets in terms of what they are going to try to achieve in terms of decreasing the amount of untreated wastewater which is discharged into the environment. So actually, there are no data available through the UN on the proportion of wastewater which is treated among the Caribbean nations. You can see some of the data for other countries that I've put in this table. Canada is around 80%, what we call safely treated wastewater. And some of the other nations, particularly in Europe, are ahead of us in terms of the proportion of wastewater which is treated. And then you see the very small proportion of wastewater which is treated in Haiti. So these are UN data, but there are no data for Caribbean countries. Basically, Caribbean countries did not supply those data to the UN. However, we do know that about 15% of the population in the Caribbean is connected to central wastewater treatment systems. The large majority of the population relies upon septic systems or even latrines for treatment of domestic wastewater. And so that's the primary mechanism for wastewater treatment in the Caribbean nations. So also what is needed then among Caribbean nations in order to meet the targets of SGD 6.3 is basically to set some national targets as well as strategies for treatment of wastewater. So basically, whether conventional primary or secondary treatment will be used, so that requires some development of infrastructure for wastewater treatment plants, or whether you're going to rely on, more cost-effective methods such as sewage lagoons or constructed wetlands in order to have some treatment of wastewater in a central manner. And also, this should include strategies for reuse of wastewater. Wastewater is a resource. It can be treated and reused, particularly for irrigation, et cetera. So that should be part of the strategies as well. Adrian Cashman, who's going to be talking to you later in the seminar series, in a publication in 2013, estimated that 85% of wastewater that is discharged to the sea in the Caribbean is basically untreated. Now, most of the time you won't see this wastewater, which is discharged into the ocean, because it's typically piped out several hundred meters out into the ocean. But I just wanted to show you what it looks like. There was a kind of a catastrophic failure which occurred in the South Shore wastewater treatment plant in Barbados, and so they had to quickly reroute the sewage from that wastewater treatment plant into the ocean. And we happened to be there when this occurred. So you can see that the channel that was quickly sort of constructed in order to carry that wastewater out into the ocean, into the coastal zone. As I said, in most situations in the Caribbean, the wastewater is actually piped out into the ocean, so you don't see it, but it's there. And so that's certainly a concern in terms of, first of all, human health impacts, but also effects upon the marine ecosystem. See how I'm doing for time. So also within that target 6.3, we have improvements in water quality. Again, this is an aspirational goal for the countries. Countries get to define what improved water quality means, and just what kinds of monitoring programs are going to put into place in order to evaluate the water quality within those regions. I've shown here a map of the countries which are actually reporting on their water quality data to the UN. You can see the US and Canada, as well as Brazil and other South American nations, as well as Europe and several other countries around the world are reporting their water quality data to the UN, to a particular agency called GEMS. But you can see that none of the Caribbean nations are actually reporting, except for Cuba, reporting their water quality data. So it's up to the island nations to, first of all, define what is good water quality. So for instance, under some jurisdictions, nitrate values less than 13 parts per million are considered targets for safe drinking water. But in other areas, 45 parts per million is considered the threshold for safe drinking water. So definitions are required in terms of what is good water quality. And then nations have to decide what parameters they want to measure in terms of evaluating water quality, and to design programs for monitoring both surface water and groundwater. How many stations? How often will they visit those stations in order to collect samples for water quality analysis? Who's going to do it? And then finally, how will the data be managed? How will you look at long-term trends in terms of evaluating water quality? So I just want to focus, I see Halis Haley is one of the individuals signed into this particular seminar. She was our contact in terms of doing a project in St. Kitts and Nevis. Part of that project was to evaluate the water quality monitoring program in both the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis, and come up with some recommendations in terms of improving the water quality on those two islands. So in St. Kitts, basically the water quality monitoring was just for water within the distribution systems for drinking water. On the island of Nevis, they were also collecting samples from groundwater and surface water sources. Currently, there is no tracking of long-term trends. Basically, the data are collected and entered into Excel spreadsheets, which is not too conducive to looking at long-term trends. And there are no sort of written protocols for disseminating data to health authorities or to the public within those island nations if there happens to be any issues with water quality. Here are the parameters which are currently being monitored. You can read them as well as I can. And what we came up with in terms of recommendations in terms of advancing the water quality monitoring program in St. Kitts and Nevis is to recommend that specifically in St. Kitts, there be monitoring of the source water, so groundwater and surface water, some improvements to the data management process, and also to add a few additional water quality parameters such as E. coli, also monitoring for nitrate and fluoride. And I'm just putting in a little plug there for my consulting company, Ambient Environmental Consulting, because this work was done through that consulting company. So that just, I should mention that St. Kitts and Nevis actually, in comparison to many of the Caribbean islands, have quite a good water quality monitoring program. So there are some improvements that we recommended to be made, but certainly they have the basics for quite a good water quality monitoring program, and that could be emulated among many of the other Caribbean nations where monitoring is not adequate. So where are we in terms of achieving those goals for SDG 6? Basically, in 2018, the UN came up with a synthesis report for SDG 6 and confirmed that the world is lagging behind in achieving those targets. Less than half of the UN member states actually were able to produce data on water quality, et cetera, to monitor progress towards those targets. And there's a lack of tools basically to track those targets and to gather the data which is needed in order to report to the UN. So the conclusion from that synthesis report was that business as usual means that those targets will be missed by 2030. And certainly here in 2022, I suspect there hasn't been another report come out by the UN. I believe there's one that's going to be issued in 2023, but one would expect that we haven't been any improvements in terms of progress towards those goals. And ECLAC basically in a report in 2018 came up with a similar conclusion in terms of progress towards SDG targets within Latin America and the Caribbean, in which most of the countries are falling short. And actually the investment across the region of Latin America and the Caribbean is less than 1%, which would be required to achieve the SDG 6 goals. And this would go towards improving wastewater treatment, improving storm drainage, increasing the capacity for access to water resources, and also providing water and sanitation services to marginalized urban areas as well as rural areas. So it's actually a relatively small investment, less than 1% of regional GDP, which is required. The question is that a priority for those nations within Latin America and the Caribbean? I have about 5 or 6 minutes to go, so I will move along. So one of the related targets is 11.5, which is to significantly reduce the number of deaths and people affected by disasters, including water-related disasters. And St. Kitts and Nevis actually are one of the few nations within the Caribbean that gather indicator data for this particular target. And you can see that these are the disruptions to basic services data, which have occurred from 2008 to the present. Of course, this is very topical because the hurricane, it was Tropical Storm Fiona passed through St. Kitts and Nevis just a couple of days ago, and of course is affecting some of the other islands as a hurricane this week. So reducing the number of disruptions to services is one of the targets within the SDGs. And certainly gathering that information in order to evaluate whether those goals are being achieved is an important process. And this is data from a report that came out from the International Monetary Fund, which basically indicates that Caribbean small island developing states are especially vulnerable to disasters, including hurricanes, as well as tsunamis and volcanic activity, as a percentage of GDP, and also the frequency of disasters which happen in the Caribbean. So this region is particularly vulnerable to those kinds of impacts. And basically the IMF came up with these recommendations in terms of what has to happen to reduce the impact of those disasters, structural protection to reduce disaster risks, resilient infrastructure, etc. And later in this seminar series, Roger Pulwarty will be talking about some of the strategies which can be used to build resilience in Caribbean small island developing states. Also financial protection, including risk financing instruments such as the insurance industry, and contingency planning. I just want to quickly talk a little bit about SDG 14, which relates to life below water. And there are 2 targets which relate to reducing marine pollution by 2025, and also a target to protect and restore ecosystems by 2020. So we've already passed those particular goals. So you're aware that the Caribbean has a rich marine ecosystem, including 10% of the world's coral reefs. And these resources are affected by a whole range of impacts, such as coastal development, wastewater and land-based pollution, as we've talked about, climate change, which is affecting coral reefs as well as fisheries, overfishing, invasive species, and sargassum. And I've shown a photo here of a star coral, which has this lobular structure, which you can see here, which is characteristic of corals that are impacted by sedimentation as a result of coastal development. But I just want to quickly also talk about sargassum. Some of you might be aware of the impact of this brown algae. And you could see some data, which I have here, up to 2018, which basically is a sargassum abundance index, which indicates the amount of sargassum which is affecting Barbados and Trinidad. These are the data which are for those two islands. And as you can see, there's been a sharp increase in sargassum abundance. And this particular photograph shows the beach area and coastal zone, which is influenced by inundations of this marine seaweed. And basically the factors which are thought to have resulted in this sharp increase in sargassum are increasing ocean temperatures, inputs of wet nutrients primarily from wastewater, as well as land-based pollution. And the next presentation will be by Dr. Marcia Serville, and she's going to talk about land-based pollution. So with that, I think I'm pretty much bang on time in terms of the timing to finish this seminar. Hopefully that's been a bit of an introduction to the entire seminar series, give you a bit of background in terms of understanding some of the environmental problems, as well as some of the solutions that we'll be talking about, or presenters will be talking about in the rest of the seminar series. So if there's any questions or comments, I'm happy to hear them.
Chris, I have a question for you, and it really relates generally to SDGs and how people perceive them and act upon them. And I guess you could say it's sort of the politics of SDGs. Do people generally, in the general public, do they understand, or are they aware of the SDGs, and do they see them as important in their lives? Because of course, politicians generally only respond to things that they think are going to affect their political lives. Yep. Or is it actually a money question in terms of reaching the goals?
I would say both. Well, one of the things I forgot to mention at the beginning was that I have a connection to the UN University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health, which is located in Hamilton. And of course, they are very much focused on the Sustainable Development Goals and, developing policy documents and evaluating how countries are doing. But among the general public, I would say probably most people are unaware of the SDGs. Maybe people in the environmental field are certainly aware of it. So there's a hill to climb there in terms of public perception. And also among our politicians. I think it really varies among countries on whether they, within the political systems, they have a focus on the SDGs. I know, for instance, many European countries are certainly part of their policies to try to achieve those goals. But in many other countries, it's just not a priority. And I would say within the Caribbean, certainly the UN agencies, which are in the Caribbean, and some of the other international agencies that are operating in the Caribbean, they're aware of it, but I'm not sure it's a huge priority with many of the governments. One of the problems, of course, is that, well, 2030 is coming up fast, but for many of these countries, they might have planning horizons of 3-4 years. So achieving goals between 2015 and 2030 wasn't a pressing issue. So I hope that kind of gives you some background. By the way, these are horse-eye jack fish that you're looking at on the screen.
Chris, maybe we should also remind people that if they are more comfortable, they are welcome to put questions into the chat function.
Oh, yeah.
And you can address them that way.
Okay, let's see if I got any. Oh, there was one, which is noise from my mic. Hopefully it wasn't too bad.
This is a pretty small question, but I was just curious on the map for St. Kitts and St. Nevis. It mentioned standpipes among like water, wastewater treatment plants and drinking water. I was wondering what that meant.
Yeah, so the standpipes are just basically pipes from which samples can be taken that are within the drinking water distribution system. So basically, this is after what is done in terms of treatment. There's a in St. Kitts, at least, there's a cistern to collect the water, and then chlorine is added for disinfection. And then there are these standpipes that are distributed throughout the water distribution system from which water samples can be collected. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that answers it. Thank you.
Okay. I've got a question here. Hi, Chris. I'm curious, for countries which depend on tourism economy so heavily, should they have the incentive to protect the environment? Yeah, I'm not sure what's meant by that, but so for instance, there is a organization called Green Globe. For instance, some hotels can be certified by Green Globe in terms of being sustainable. And for some people that are making, reservations to go to a hotel in the Caribbean or elsewhere, certainly having a Green Globe certification is one incentive for them to, make the reservation at that hotel. So for those people that are concerned about sustainability and protecting the environment, that kind of incentive program is important. In terms of whether there are other incentives for hotels, etc., to have sustainable practices, not really. They are more things like the costs of obtaining water. So on the amounts that are charged on a per liter basis by utilities within those countries for access to water. So certainly, having some programs to conserve water is part of that. Also, energy use. There are some incentive programs to move to sustainable sources of energy, and a couple of our presenters later in the seminar series will be talking about that, using other alternative sources of energy, etc. So there are some programs out there which are available to some Caribbean nations as incentives to protect the environment. Actually, one of the individuals is asking how to connect with me. Julia, do we distribute emails? Yeah, okay. Emails and how to connect with the presenters on the website. Okay. And then another question is, how do we get the recording for today? Question, we all know the dilemma of AOSIS countries regarding climate change. How do we weigh the trade-offs among adaptation, mitigation policies, survival, and economic development? Well, that could take a whole presentation. And what I would suggest is that when Roger Pulwarty talks about building resilience to climate change, et cetera, I believe he will be addressing many of those issues, trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation, et cetera. So I encourage you to all, tune in for many of the presentations. What I talked about today was just a tip of the iceberg, so to speak, in terms of some of the subject materials that will be part of the discussions from the other presenters.
Chris, maybe you could just put your email into the chat function here in case anybody wants to contact you directly.
Sure. See if I spelled that. Okay, there you go. Well, thank you. Good questions and comments.